On the way to my company's succession meeting, a note was slipped through my car window. "Your daughter-in-law set you up." I gripped the paper tightly. When I opened the office door, the shock on her face was all I needed to see. But then everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled in that single moment.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. I'd been preparing for this succession meeting for months, carefully reviewing every detail of transitioning leadership of Meridian Holdings to my son Robert. At 68, I was ready to step back from the day-to-day operations of the company I'd built from nothing 35 years ago. The business had grown from a small consulting firm operating out of my kitchen to a multi-million-dollar enterprise with offices in 3 states. I remember parking my silver Honda in the usual spot outside our downtown headquarters. The October air was crisp, and the trees lining the street had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. I was gathering my briefcase and the folder containing the succession documents when I heard footsteps approaching. A young woman I didn't recognize walked quickly past my car, but as she did, she slipped a folded piece of paper through the crack in my window. By the time I looked up, she was already disappearing around the corner. I sat there for a moment, staring at the white paper on my passenger seat. My first instinct was to ignore it. In my years of business, I'd learned that anonymous notes rarely contained anything worth reading, but something about the urgency in the woman's movement made me curious. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, feminine. "Your daughter-in-law set you up. Check the documents before you sign anything. A friend." My heart started racing. Victoria, my son's wife of 8 years? The woman who'd been so supportive during my husband's illness and death 3 years ago. The mother of my grandson Brian? It didn't make sense. I tried to shake off the unease as I walked toward the building. Victoria had been nothing but helpful since joining our family. When Robert expressed interest in eventually taking over the company, she'd encouraged him. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by certain aspects of the business, she'd suggested I delegate more responsibilities. She'd even helped me find a wonderful assistant when my previous one retired. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. I kept thinking about the note, trying to rationalize it away. Someone was probably playing a cruel joke, or maybe they had me confused with someone else. Victoria loved this family. She loved Robert. She would never do anything to hurt us. But then I remembered something that had been bothering me for weeks. Victoria had been coming to the office more frequently lately, always with some reason to help with the transition planning. She'd volunteered to review contracts, organize files, and coordinate with our legal team. I'd been grateful for the assistance, especially since Robert was often traveling for his current job. The elevator doors opened, and I walked down the familiar hallway toward the conference room where our meeting was scheduled. Through the glass walls, I could see Victoria already inside, papers spread across the mahogany table. She was speaking quietly on her phone, but when she saw me approaching, she ended the call quickly and smiled. That smile. How had I never noticed how it never quite reached her eyes? I paused outside the door, watching her for a moment. She was arranging documents with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Too much efficiency, perhaps. My assistant Helen wasn't supposed to arrive for another 20 minutes, and the lawyers weren't due until 10 o'clock. Why was Victoria here so early? When I opened the door, her face went white. Not the pale surprise of someone caught off guard, but the ashen color of someone caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. "Diana," she said, her voice higher than usual. "You're early. I was just getting everything organized for the meeting." I looked at the papers scattered across the table. Some I recognized as the documents we'd been preparing for weeks. Others looked different, newer. "What are those?" I asked, pointing to a stack of papers near her left hand. "Oh, these?" She quickly gathered them up. "Just some additional paperwork our attorney suggested. Nothing important." Nothing important. But she was holding them like they were precious secrets. I set my briefcase down and moved closer to the table. "Victoria, may I see those documents?" "Of course, but they're really just backup copies of things you've already reviewed." She was backing away from the table now, the papers clutched against her chest. "Then you won't mind showing them to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the conference room, I could hear the normal sounds of an office building coming to life. Phones ringing, elevator doors opening and closing. the distant hum of conversation. But inside this room, the air felt thick with tension. Victoria's carefully composed mask was beginning to slip. "Diana, I think maybe you should sit down. You look tired. Are you feeling all right?" There it was, the same tone she'd been using more frequently over the past few months. Gentle concern tinged with something else. Something that made me feel like a confused elderly woman instead of the sharp businesswoman I'd always been. "I'm feeling perfectly fine," I said firmly. "What I'm not feeling is inclined to sit down in my own conference room while someone refuses to show me documents related to my own company." Victoria's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it nervously. "That's Robert. He's running a few minutes late." "Good. That gives us time to talk." I moved around the table, positioning myself between Victoria and the door. It wasn't a conscious decision, but some instinct told me she might try to leave with those papers. "Talk about what?" she asked, but her voice was strained now. "About why you're here an hour before our meeting, shuffling through documents that you say aren't important but won't let me see." "Diana, I'm worried about you. You've been forgetting things lately, getting confused about details. Maybe this transition is happening too quickly." Forgetting things, getting confused. I'd been hearing these phrases more often lately, usually from Victoria. She'd mention how I'd supposedly forgotten a conversation we'd had, or express concern when I couldn't remember details of meetings I was certain I'd never attended. "What exactly have I forgotten?" I asked. "Just little things. Last week you couldn't remember agreeing to move the quarterly board meeting to December. The week before that, you seemed confused about the new accounting procedures we'd discussed. But I hadn't agreed to move the board meeting, and we'd never discussed new accounting procedures." "Victoria," I said slowly, "show me those documents, now." She looked toward the door, then back at me. I could see her calculating, trying to decide how to handle this situation. Finally, she sighed and set the papers on the table. "Fine, but I want you to know I was only trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I picked up the top document and started reading. It was a medical evaluation form, partially filled out, with my name at the top. The section marked Cognitive Assessment had several boxes checked, indicating memory loss, confusion, and diminished decision-making capacity. I'd never seen this form before in my life. I'd certainly never undergone any cognitive assessment. "What is this?" I whispered. Dr. Patterson thought it would be helpful to have a baseline assessment, given your age and the stress of the transition. Dr. Patterson was my longtime physician, a man I'd known for 20 years. "When did I see Dr. Patterson for this assessment?" "Last month. You were having trouble remembering, so I drove you to the appointment. But I would remember a cognitive assessment. I would remember being driven to such an appointment by my daughter-in-law. I would remember agreeing to it in the first place." I flipped to the next document. It was a letter from Dr. Patterson to Robert, recommending that I undergo gentle supervision during the business transition due to early signs of cognitive decline. My hands were shaking now. "Victoria, I never had this appointment. I never agreed to any assessment. Diana, please sit down. You're getting upset, and that's not good for you." "I'm not getting upset because I'm confused. I'm getting upset because someone has forged medical documents using my name." The words hung in the air between us. Victoria's face had gone completely pale now, and I could see her mind racing. "That's a very serious accusation," she said carefully. "Yes, it is. And I'm going to call Dr. Patterson right now to confirm whether or not I had this appointment." I reached for my phone, but Victoria stepped forward quickly. "Diana, wait. Maybe we should talk to Robert first. He's been so worried about you, worried about me, because of what Victoria had been telling him." I understood now. The note had been accurate. Victoria had set me up, not just for today's meeting, but for weeks, maybe months. She'd been systematically undermining my credibility, making me appear forgetful and confused, preparing the ground for this moment. "What else is in this stack of papers?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Victoria didn't answer. She was staring at her phone again, probably texting Robert to hurry up and get here before his mother caused more trouble. I picked up the rest of the documents and started reading. Power of attorney forms with Robert's name as my designated representative. Updated company bylaws that would give Robert complete control immediately, rather than the gradual transition we'd planned. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter of resignation with my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. It was close, very close. But the D in Diana was wrong. I'd been writing my name the same way for 68 years. I stared at the forged signature until my vision blurred. 8 years. 8 years of family dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. 8 years of watching Victoria hold my grandson, listening to her call me Mom Diana with what I'd believed was genuine affection. 8 years of building trust with someone who'd been systematically destroying me from the inside. Diana? Victoria's voice seemed to come from very far away. Maybe you should sit down. You look pale. I looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. The perfectly styled blonde hair, the expensive clothes that my son's salary couldn't possibly afford, the manicured nails that had never done a day of real work. When had I stopped seeing her clearly? How long have you been planning this? I asked. Planning what? Diana, you're scaring me. You're talking about forged signatures and conspiracies. This isn't like you. But it was like me, the real me, the woman who'd built a company from nothing, who'd fought through a male-dominated industry for 3 decades, who'd negotiated million-dollar deals and never backed down from a challenge. Somehow, Victoria had made me forget that woman existed. Answer my question, I said, my voice gaining strength. How long have you been planning to have me declared incompetent? Victoria's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, and I saw relief flash across her face. Robert's in the parking lot. He'll be here in a few minutes. Of course. Robert would come to rescue his poor, confused mother from her delusions. Robert, who'd been watching me with increasing concern lately, asking gentle questions about my memory, suggesting I might want to consider reducing my responsibilities. Victoria, I want you to tell me something, and I want the truth. Did I really forget about moving the board meeting to December? She hesitated. You seemed confused when I mentioned it. That's not what I asked. Did I agree to move the meeting? Well, we discussed it. When? Where? What day? I don't remember the specific details, Diana. It was just a conversation. No, it wasn't, because it never happened. I was gaining clarity now, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Just like the conversation about new accounting procedures never happened. Just like the appointment with Dr. Patterson never happened. Diana, please. You're getting worked up over nothing. Over nothing? I held up the medical evaluation form. This says I have memory loss and diminished decision-making capacity. This suggests I'm no longer competent to run my own company. You call that nothing? Victoria moved toward the door. I think we should wait for Robert. I think you should explain to me how Dr. Patterson's signature ended up on a document evaluating a patient visit that never occurred. She stopped walking. What do you mean? I mean I'm going to call Dr. Patterson right now. And when he tells me he never saw me for a cognitive assessment, you're going to explain to me how his signature got on this form. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Dr. Patterson's office number. Victoria watched me, her face growing paler by the second. Diana, wait. Let me explain. I paused with my finger over the call button. I'm listening. Dr. Patterson didn't see you for an assessment, but he's been concerned about you based on conversations Robert and I have had with him about your recent behavior. What behavior? The forgetfulness, the confusion, the way you've been making decisions that don't seem well thought out. Such as? Victoria began pacing around the conference table, like when you wanted to hire that new accountant without checking his references. Or when you almost signed that contract with the construction company that turned out to be fraudulent. I felt like I was in a fun house, where nothing was as it seemed. Victoria, I never tried to hire an accountant without checking references. And what construction company contract? You don't remember? I don't remember because it didn't happen. But Robert was there when we discussed the accountant. He was the one who suggested we do more research. My son, my wonderful, trusting son, who'd always believed the best about everyone. What had Victoria told him? What lies had she fed him about his own mother? Where is this contract you say I almost signed? Robert has a copy. He's been keeping track of these incidents because he's worried about you. Keeping track. My own son had been keeping a file of my supposed mental decline, documented by my daughter-in-law. The elevator dinged in the hallway outside. Robert's voice carried through the glass walls as he greeted Helen, who must have just arrived. Victoria, I said quickly, before Robert gets here, I need you to tell me the truth about one thing. Did you forge Dr. Patterson's signature on this evaluation? I would never forge a medical document. That's not what I asked. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Dr. Patterson agreed that an evaluation would be helpful. He just hasn't had time to see you officially. So you created the evaluation yourself and signed his name to it. I created a preliminary assessment based on his professional opinion, without his knowledge. He knows about it. Does he know his signature is on it? The conference room door opened before she could answer. Robert walked in, his tall frame filling the doorway. At 40, he looked so much like his father that it sometimes took my breath away. The same dark hair, the same kind brown eyes, the same gentle smile that had made me fall in love with his father 35 years ago. "Morning, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. "Sorry I'm running late. Traffic was terrible." He looked around the room, taking in the scattered papers. Victoria's pale face, my rigid posture. "Everything okay in here?" "Actually, no," I said. "We need to talk." Victoria shot me a warning look. "Diana's been feeling a little overwhelmed this morning. Maybe we should postpone the meeting." "Overwhelmed by discovering that someone has been creating false medical documents in my name," I said. Robert's face went from confused to concerned in seconds. "What are you talking about?" I handed him the evaluation form. "Your wife has been documenting my supposed cognitive decline, apparently with Dr. Patterson's input, though I've never been examined by him for any such thing." Robert read the form, his frown deepening. "Mom, when did you have this assessment?" "I didn't. That's what I'm trying to tell you." He looked at Victoria. "Honey, what's going on?" "Robert, your mother has been having some confusion lately. This morning she's gotten upset about documents she doesn't remember discussing. I think maybe the stress of the transition is affecting her more than we realized." I watched my son's face as he processed this information. I could see him weighing what he was hearing against what he'd been observing about me over the past few months. All those times Victoria had mentioned my forgetfulness, all those incidents she'd documented, all those gentle suggestions that maybe I needed more help, more supervision, more protection from my own poor judgment. "Mom," he said gently, "do you remember our conversation last week about the board meeting?" "What conversation?" "When you agreed to move it to December because of the McKinnon project deadline." I stared at him. "Robert, I never agreed to move the board meeting." "And what McKinnon project?" Robert and Victoria exchanged a look. It was subtle, but I caught it. The look of two people who'd been discussing my mental state behind my back. "The McKinnon project," Robert said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "The one you've been working on for the past month. The reason we need to accelerate the transition timeline." "Robert, I have never heard of a McKinnon project. I have no idea what you're talking about." "Honey," Victoria said to Robert, "this is what I was trying to explain to you. She's been having more and more of these memory gaps. Memory gaps, as if I were a broken recording, skipping over important parts of my own life." "Show me," I said. "Show me documentation of this McKinnon project." Robert looked confused. "Mom, you have all the files. They're in your office. Then let's go to my office. Right now." "Diana," Victoria interrupted, "maybe we should reschedule this meeting. You seem agitated, and that's not going to help anyone make good decisions." "The only agitation I feel is from discovering that someone has been lying to my family about my mental state." Robert put his hand on my arm. "Mom, no one's lying. We're all just concerned about you." Concerned. The word that had been following me around for months. Everyone was so concerned about poor Diana, who couldn't remember conversations she'd never had about projects that didn't exist. "Robert, I want you to call Dr. Patterson right now." "Why?" "Because I want him to confirm whether or not he conducted a cognitive assessment on me last month." "Mom, even if you don't remember the appointment, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just call him, please." Robert looked at Victoria again. She gave a small shake of her head, so subtle I almost missed it. "Let's table this for now," Robert said. "We have lawyers coming in 20 minutes for the succession meeting. We can sort out any confusion about medical appointments later." "There's no confusion, Robert. There's deception. And I'm not signing anything until we get to the bottom of it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and she knew it. But she wasn't giving up without a fight. "Diana," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone again, "I understand that you're feeling confused and frightened. Change is hard, especially at your age. But Robert and I are here to help you through this transition. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore, at my age." as if being 68 automatically meant being incompetent. "The only burden I'm carrying," I said, "is the knowledge that someone I trusted has been systematically undermining me for months, possibly years." "Mom," Robert said, and I could hear the pain in his voice. "Victoria loves you. We both love you. We're trying to help." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and kind, and I realized that Victoria hadn't just been deceiving me, she'd been deceiving him too. He genuinely believed I was losing my mental faculties because she'd been feeding him carefully crafted lies for months. She hadn't just been planning to steal my company, she'd been planning to steal my family. The knock on the conference room door came at exactly 10 o'clock. Helen's voice carried through the glass. "Mrs. Morrison, your attorneys are here." I looked at the two people I'd loved most in the world and realized I didn't know either of them anymore. Robert, my son, who believed I was losing my mind because his wife had been feeding him lies for months. Victoria, my daughter-in-law, who I now understood had been playing a long game that would leave me with nothing. "Send them in, Helen," I called out, making a decision that would change everything. Victoria stood quickly. "Diana, maybe we should postpone this. You're clearly not in the right frame of mind for such important decisions." "Actually, I've never been more clear about anything in my life." The conference room door opened and two familiar figures entered. James Patterson, my attorney for the past 15 years, and Michelle Chen, the corporate lawyer who'd been helping with the succession planning. They both carried thick briefcases and wore the serious expressions of people preparing to witness major business decisions. "Good morning, Diana," James said warmly. "Are we ready to make some history today?" "We're ready to make something," I replied. "James, before we begin, I need to ask you about something. Have you received any medical documentation regarding my mental capacity?" James looked confused. "Medical documentation? From whom?" "Anyone. Dr. Patterson, perhaps, or any other physician." "Diana, no. Why would I receive medical documentation about you?" I felt Victoria shift uncomfortably beside me. Robert was staring at the table, his jaw tight with what I now recognized as embarrassment rather than concern. "Because someone has been suggesting that I might not be competent to make business decisions." Michelle Chen set down her briefcase and looked around the room. "Is there some question about today's proceedings? Because if there's any doubt about competency, we should address that before moving forward with any legal documents." "There's no doubt about my competency," I said firmly. "But there seems to be some doubt about the honesty of the people I've trusted to help me plan this transition." "Mom," Robert started, but I held up my hand. "Robert, I want you to call Dr. Patterson's office right now. Ask them to check their records for any cognitive assessment conducted on me in the past 6 months." "Diana, this is embarrassing," Victoria interjected. "You're making everyone uncomfortable with these accusations." "James," I said, ignoring her, "are you uncomfortable with verifying the mental capacity of someone about to transfer control of a multi-million-dollar company?" "Not at all. In fact, it's standard practice in situations where there might be any question." Victoria's face went white. "There's no question. Diana's just been under a lot of stress lately. Then you won't mind if Robert makes that phone call," I said. The silence in the room was deafening. Michelle Chen was taking notes, probably documenting what might turn into a legal issue. James was watching Victoria with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades recognizing deception in conference rooms. Robert pulled out his phone with obvious reluctance. "What exactly do you want me to ask them?" "Ask if I had an appointment for a cognitive assessment last month. Ask if Dr. Patterson has written any letters to you about my mental state. Ask if he's signed any evaluation forms regarding my competency." Robert dialed the number. We all listened as he spoke to the receptionist, then waited while she checked the records. The minutes stretched endlessly. "Thank you," Robert finally said, ending the call. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mom, Dr. Patterson's office has no record of any cognitive assessment. No appointment last month. No letters to me. No evaluation forms." The room fell silent except for the sound of Victoria's sharp intake of breath. "I see," James said slowly. "And where did these evaluation forms come from?" I pulled the medical documents from the stack and handed them to him. "My daughter-in-law presented these to me this morning as evidence of my declining mental state." James studied the forms, his expression growing more serious by the moment. Diana, this appears to be Dr. Patterson's signature. It appears to be, yes, but as we just confirmed, he never conducted these evaluations. Victoria, Robert said, his voice carefully controlled. Can you explain this? Victoria had been backed into a corner, and I could see her calculating her options. Deny everything and hope Robert would believe her over his own mother? Admit to some small deception while minimizing the larger scheme? Or double down on the lies she'd been telling for months? She chose the third option. Robert, your mother has been having serious memory issues. Dr. Patterson has been concerned about her based on our conversations with him about her behavior. These forms document patterns we've all observed, but he didn't sign them, Michelle Chen pointed out. He agreed with the assessment. The documentation was just a formality. A formality that involved forging a physician's signature, James said. That's a serious crime, Victoria. I didn't forge anything. I simply documented what Dr. Patterson had already told us, with his signature on forms he never signed, I said. Victoria turned to Robert with tears in her eyes. Honey, you've seen how she's been lately. The confusion, the forgetfulness, the poor decisions. You know I would never do anything to hurt your mother. I've been trying to protect her. I watched my son's face as he processed everything. The phone call to Dr. Patterson's office, the forged medical documents, the realization that conversations he thought he'd had with me had never actually occurred. Robert, I said gently, tell me about the McKinnon project. What about it? Tell me what it involves, what company we're working with, what the timeline is, any details you can remember. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Victoria handles most of the project coordination now. I just know it's important and time-sensitive. Victoria, tell us about the McKinnon project. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. It's a complex client engagement. Multiple phases, tight deadlines. What industry is McKinnon in? Michelle Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Consulting. What type of consulting? Strategic planning. And their specific needs from Meridian Holdings? Victoria was floundering now. Market analysis. Operational restructuring. The usual comprehensive package we provide. I pulled out my phone and opened the search browser. Let me look up McKinnon Consulting. I typed in the name and waited. That's interesting. There's no McKinnon Consulting in our area. There's a McKinnon Construction in Seattle, a McKinnon Medical Group in Florida, but no consulting firm. Maybe I have the name wrong, Victoria said weakly. Maybe there is no project, Robert said, and I could hear the anger building in his voice. Of course there's a project. Robert, you've seen the files. What files? Where? In Diana's office, in the McKinnon folder. I stood up. Let's go look at these files right now. Diana, maybe we should finish the succession meeting first, Victoria said desperately. No, James said firmly. If there are questions about the circumstances leading up to this meeting, we need to resolve them before proceeding with any legal transfers. We all walked down the hallway to my office, a strange parade of lawyers, family members, and mounting suspicion. My office was exactly as I'd left it the night before. Neat, organized, with client files arranged alphabetically in the credenza behind my desk. Victoria, show us the McKinnon folder, I said. She went to the credenza and pulled out a manila folder labeled McKinnon Strategic Consulting. I'd never seen it before in my life. May I? James asked, reaching for the folder. Inside were contracts, project timelines, correspondence with a client I'd never heard of, and my signature on documents I'd never signed. The same slightly incorrect signature I'd noticed on the resignation letter that morning. Diana, James said carefully, did you sign these contracts? I've never seen them before. And that's not my signature. It looks like your signature. Look at the D in Diana. It's wrong. I've been signing my name the same way for 68 years. James compared the signatures on the McKinnon documents to my signature on legitimate contracts in other files. The difference was subtle, but clear once you knew what to look for. Victoria, Robert said, his voice deadly quiet. Did you create these documents? Robert, please, let me explain. Did you create fake contracts with a fake client to make me believe my mother was becoming incompetent? The tears started flowing then. Real tears, I thought, but tears of self-pity rather than remorse. I was trying to help. The company needs young leadership. Diana's been making mistakes, and I was afraid she'd destroy everything you're supposed to inherit. What mistakes? Michelle Chen asked. Small things. memory lapses, poor judgment calls. Give me one specific example, I said. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't remember them because you don't remember them." The circular logic was maddening. I was incompetent because I couldn't remember things that had never happened. "Victoria," James said, "document forgery is a felony. Identity theft is a felony. If you've been signing Diana's name to contracts without her knowledge, you could face serious criminal charges. All I wanted was to protect this family's future. By destroying my relationship with my son?" I asked. "By making him believe his mother was losing her mind? You don't understand the pressure Robert's been under. Watching you struggle, worrying about the company, trying to figure out how to help you without hurting your feelings." I looked at Robert. "Is that true? Have you been watching me struggle?" My son looked exhausted. "Mom, I thought I was." Victoria kept pointing out things you'd supposedly forgotten, decisions you'd supposedly made that seemed out of character. I started questioning my own observations about you, because she was creating a false narrative about my mental state. "Because I thought I was protecting you both," Victoria said. "From what?" "From the pain of watching Diana decline. From the difficulty of taking control away from someone you love." "But I wasn't declining," I said. "You were creating the appearance of decline." Robert sat down heavily in one of my office chairs. "Victoria, how long has this been going on?" "How long has what been going on?" "The lies, the fake documents, the made-up projects and forged signatures." Victoria looked around the room at all of us watching her, waiting for an answer that would explain how someone could systematically destroy a family through deception. "I just wanted us to be secure," she whispered. "I wanted Brian to have a stable future." "Brian," I said, suddenly understanding another layer of her motivation. "This is about Brian inheriting the company. He's Robert's son, your grandson. Doesn't he deserve to inherit a thriving business instead of whatever would be left after years of poor management? Poor management by me. By anyone over 65 who should have retired years ago." There it was. The truth finally. Victoria didn't think I was becoming incompetent. She thought I was already incompetent because of my age. She'd been manufacturing evidence to support a conclusion she'd already reached. "Victoria," Robert said, "you've been lying to me for months about my own mother. I've been protecting our family's interests by destroying our family." The weight of what had been done to us was settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Victoria had used my love for my family against me, turned my son into an unwitting accomplice in my own downfall, and created a web of deception so complex that untangling it would take months. But as I stood in my office, surrounded by forged documents and broken trust, I realized something important. I wasn't the confused, declining woman Victoria had tried to make me believe I was. I was still the sharp, determined businesswoman who'd built this company from nothing. And I was going to use every skill I'd learned in 35 years of business to make sure Victoria never had the chance to hurt another family the way she'd hurt mine. The aftermath of that morning's revelations left my office feeling like a crime scene. James and Michelle had gathered all the forged documents as evidence, while Robert sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that his wife had been manipulating him for months. Victoria had stopped crying and retreated into a cold, calculating silence that was somehow more unsettling than her earlier tears. "I think we should postpone the succession meeting indefinitely," I announced. "I need time to understand the full scope of what's been done to my company and my family." "Diana, that's probably wise," James agreed. "We'll need to conduct a thorough audit of all company documents to determine what else might have been compromised." Victoria finally spoke. "This is an overreaction. So I made some mistakes in judgment, created some documentation that wasn't technically accurate. That doesn't change the fact that Robert is ready to take over the company." "Mistakes in judgment?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. "Victoria, you forged medical documents. You created fake contracts. You've been lying to me about my own mother for months. I was protecting your interests by making me believe my mother was losing her mind." I watched this exchange with a mixture of sadness and growing determination. Victoria still didn't understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She saw it as a minor deception in service of a greater good, not as the systematic destruction of a family's trust. "Robert," I said gently, "why don't you take the rest of the day off? Spend some time with Brian, process all of this." What about Victoria? I looked at my daughter-in-law, who was gathering her purse and the few papers that weren't being confiscated as evidence. Victoria and I need to have a private conversation. Diana, I don't think that's wise, James warned. Given the circumstances, you should have a witness present for any discussions with Victoria. Then stay, please. You too, Michelle. I want this all documented. After Robert left, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in one morning, I sat behind my desk and studied Victoria. Without her tears and desperate explanations, she looked different, harder, more calculating. Victoria, I want you to tell me exactly when this started. When did you first decide that I needed to be removed from my own company? I never decided you needed to be removed. I decided you needed help. Help forging documents? Help creating fake clients? Help undermining my relationship with my son? Victoria straightened in her chair, and I caught a glimpse of the woman she'd been hiding beneath the concerned daughter-in-law facade. Diana, you're 68 years old. You built this company in a different era, with different challenges. The business world has evolved, and frankly, so have the demands of running a modern enterprise. I see. And you determined this how? By watching you struggle with technology, seeing you make decisions based on outdated practices, observing your resistance to change. Give me one example of a decision I made based on outdated practices. Victoria was quiet for a moment. You still insist on paper contracts instead of digital signatures. Because paper contracts are legally more secure and harder to forge. As you well know, since you had to physically create fake documents rather than simply altering digital files. James was taking notes furiously. Michelle was recording the conversation on her phone. What about your resistance to social media marketing? Victoria tried again. I hired a marketing firm that specializes in social media. What resistance? You question their strategies. I ask for explanations of their strategies. That's called due diligence, not resistance. Victoria was running out of examples because her examples were fabricated, just like everything else she'd been telling Robert about me. Victoria, I said, leaning forward, I want you to understand something. I'm not angry because you think I'm too old to run my company. I'm angry because you decided to destroy my family instead of having an honest conversation about your concerns. I tried to have honest conversations. You wouldn't listen. When? Give me one specific example of when you tried to discuss your concerns with me directly. Again, silence, because it had never happened. You know what I think? I continued. I think you saw an opportunity to position Robert as the company leader while positioning yourself as the power behind the throne. You never intended for this to be about his capabilities. This was about your ambitions. That's not true. Isn't it? Tell me, Victoria, what's your educational background in business management? I have a degree in communications. From where? State University. Which state university? Does it matter? It matters because I'm starting to wonder if anything you've told us about yourself is true. Victoria's face flushed. You can't investigate me like I'm some kind of criminal. Actually, document forgery and identity theft are criminal acts. So yes, I can and will investigate you exactly like the criminal you've proven yourself to be. The mask was coming off completely now. Victoria stood up, her composure cracking. You have no idea what it's like to be married to someone whose mother controls every aspect of his life. Controls every aspect of his life? Victoria, I see Robert maybe twice a month for dinner. You see him twice a month, but he talks about you constantly. Diana thinks this. Diana would do that. Diana built the company this way. Everything in his life is measured against what his mother would approve of, and that bothered you. It bothered me that he could never make a decision without considering what you would think. It bothered me that our future was entirely dependent on when you decided to retire. It bothered me that my son would inherit a company run into the ground by someone too stubborn to admit she was past her prime. There it was, the real Victoria, not the concerned daughter-in-law worried about my mental state, but the ambitious woman frustrated by having to wait for her inheritance. So you decided to accelerate the timeline. I decided to help Robert see that it was time for him to step up. By making him believe I was mentally incompetent. By helping him recognize signs he was too close to see clearly. Signs you manufactured. Victoria sat back down, apparently realizing she'd revealed too much. I think I should call a lawyer. That's probably a good idea, James said, because Diana has grounds for both civil and criminal action against you. For what? Trying to help my family? For fraud, forgery, identity theft, and elder abuse, Michelle Chen listed. Possibly conspiracy, depending on whether you had any accomplices. Elder abuse? Victoria laughed bitterly. Diana's not some helpless old woman. She's a shrewd businesswoman who built a multi-million-dollar company, which makes your systematic campaign to portray her as mentally incompetent even more egregious, James pointed out. I watched Victoria process this information. She was finally beginning to understand that her actions had consequences beyond family drama. What do you want from me? She asked. I want you to tell me if there are any other forged documents I should know about. Any other fake clients, fake projects, fake anything that might affect my company. There's nothing else. Victoria, you've lied about everything for months. Why should I believe you now? Because I'm not stupid enough to expose myself to more criminal charges. You were stupid enough to forge medical documents and create fake contracts. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, There's one other thing. My stomach dropped. What? I may have used the company credit card for some personal expenses. What kind of personal expenses? Nothing major. Dinners, clothes, some travel expenses when Robert and I went out of town. How much? Maybe $5,000 over the past year. James was writing furiously. Victoria, that's embezzlement. I was going to pay it back. When? After the succession was complete and Robert had control of the company finances. So you were going to use company funds to pay back money you stole from the company? Victoria looked confused. I was going to reimburse the company from our personal account, with money that would have come from Robert's salary, which would have come from the company you were stealing from. The circular logic of her plan was becoming clear. Victoria had created an elaborate scheme to position herself as the real power in the company, with Robert as a figurehead and me pushed aside as mentally incompetent. She'd been spending company money as if it were already hers, planning to legitimize the theft once she had control. Victoria, I said, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You're going to resign from any and all positions you hold with Meridian Holdings, effective immediately. You're going to provide a full accounting of every company expense you've charged to personal use, and you're going to stay away from this company and its employees. You can't ban me from the company. Robert works here. Robert is an employee. You're not. And if you set foot on company property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Robert won't stand for this. Robert will stand for whatever protects his son and his future. You've destroyed his trust, Victoria. You've made him question his own judgment and his mother's mental capacity. Do you really think he's going to choose you over the family you nearly destroyed? Victoria stood up again, this time with the rigid posture of someone who knew they'd lost but wasn't ready to admit it. This isn't over, Diana. Yes, it is. James, please escort Victoria to her car and make sure she leaves the property. As they left, Michelle Chen and I sat in the quiet of my office, surrounded by evidence of months of deception. Diana, what do you want to do about the criminal charges? I thought about Robert, about Brian, about the family Victoria had almost succeeded in destroying. I want to talk to Robert first. This affects him and Brian, too. And if she's done this before, to other families, that was a chilling thought. What if Victoria had a history of targeting families, identifying vulnerable situations, and exploiting them for personal gain? Then we'll make sure she doesn't get the chance to do it again. I picked up my phone and called a number I hadn't used in years, a private investigator I'd worked with during some corporate security issues in the past. Angela? It's Diana Morrison. I need you to run a complete background check on someone. And Angela, I need it done quietly and thoroughly. I have a feeling what we found today is just the tip of the iceberg. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Victoria had made one crucial mistake in her campaign against me. She'd underestimated the woman she was trying to destroy. The same skills that had built Meridian Holdings from nothing were now going to be used to make sure she never had the chance to hurt another family the way she'd hurt mine. The hunter had become the hunted, and I intended to make sure Victoria understood exactly what that meant. Angela Martinez called me back 3 days later. I was in my office working late as I often did when I needed to think clearly. The building was quiet, just the security guard making his rounds and the distant hum of the heating system. "Diana, you need to sit down for this," Angela said without preamble. I'd known Angela for 12 years. She was a former FBI agent who'd gone into private investigation after retiring, and she had a reputation for being thorough and discreet. If she was telling me to sit down, I knew I wasn't going to like what she'd found. "Tell me." Victoria Morrison isn't her real name. She was born Victoria Lynn Chambers in Ohio. She's been married 4 times, not once. She has a history of targeting older individuals and their families, gaining their trust, then systematically undermining them while positioning herself to inherit or control their assets. My hands went cold. 4 times? Her first husband was 62 when they married. She was 24. He had a modest inheritance from his parents and owned a small accounting firm. Within 2 years of their marriage, his adult children were convinced he was developing dementia. He signed over power of attorney to Victoria, who promptly sold the business and most of his assets. When the children tried to intervene, she had him moved to a memory care facility. What happened to him? He died 6 months later, stroke. Victoria inherited everything as his surviving spouse. The children contested the will, but by then she'd disappeared. I felt sick. And the others? Husband number 2 was 71, a widower with a successful restaurant in Colorado. Same pattern. Victoria convinced his family that he was becoming mentally incompetent, gradually isolated him from his support system, gained control of his finances. This time the family fought back sooner, but not before she'd transferred substantial assets offshore. She vanished before the criminal charges were filed. Did they catch her? No, she's very good at creating new identities and disappearing when things get complicated. Husband number 3 was in Nevada, number 4 in Oregon. Each time, the pattern was similar. Target someone with assets, marry them, undermine their mental capacity in the eyes of their family, gain control, then disappear with whatever she could steal. But Robert isn't elderly. He's 40. No, but you are. And you're the one with the real assets. Robert was never the target, Diana. He was the tool she planned to use to get to you. Think about it. If she'd convinced him that you were mentally incompetent and needed care, if she'd maneuvered him into taking control of the company, who do you think would have been the real power behind his decisions? The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Victoria hadn't just been impatient about waiting for an inheritance. She was a professional predator who specialized in destroying families and stealing their wealth. Angela, is there more? There's more. Victoria Chambers has never had a child. She's been claiming Brian as her son, but according to hospital records in Oregon, she had a 2-ball ligation 8 years ago. Brian Morrison isn't her biological child. The room started spinning. What are you saying? I'm saying someone else is Brian's mother, and I think I know who. I gripped the phone tighter. Tell me. Robert was married before Victoria, briefly, when he was in his 20s. Her name was Sarah Chen. They divorced after 2 years. But Diana, she was pregnant when the divorce was finalized. Sarah Chen. I remembered her vaguely. Robert had brought her to a few family dinners during their short marriage. She was quiet, kind, seemed overwhelmed by Robert's world. I'd assumed their divorce was just a young marriage that didn't work out. Where is Sarah now? That's where it gets complicated. Sarah died in a car accident 7 years ago. According to court records, she had custody of Brian, but Robert was listed as the father with visitation rights. After Sarah's death, Brian went to live with her mother, Helen Chen. But 6 months later, Victoria appeared, claiming to be Robert's new girlfriend. She convinced Helen that Robert wanted to raise his son himself, that it would be better for Brian to be with his father. And Helen believed her? Helen was 75, grieving her daughter's death, struggling to care for a young child. Victoria presented legal documents showing Robert's paternity and his desire to take custody. The documents appeared legitimate. Helen, exhausted and overwhelmed, agreed to let Brian go live with his father. But the documents were fake. We can't prove that yet, but given Victoria's history, it's likely. What we do know is that Robert never requested custody of Brian through legal channels. Victoria brought Brian to him as a fait accompli, told him that Sarah's family couldn't care for the child anymore, and that as Brian's father, he needed to step up. I thought about my grandson, the little boy I'd loved for 8 years, believing he was my daughter-in-law's child. All this time, he'd been my son's child, with a woman I'd barely known, a woman who died tragically young, leaving her son to be claimed by a predator who saw him as a tool in her larger scheme. Angela, where is Helen Chen now? Still alive? Still in Oregon? I think she'd very much like to see her grandson again. The implications were staggering. Victoria had stolen Brian from his grandmother, used him to establish credibility with Robert, then used both of them to position herself to steal from me. She'd built her entire life with our family on a foundation of lies, theft, and manipulation. There's one more thing, Diana. Victoria isn't broke. She's accumulated significant assets from her previous marriages. She's been living modestly with Robert to maintain the appearance of being financially dependent. But she has offshore accounts worth nearly $2 million. So she didn't need the money. She didn't need the money. She wanted the control and the thrill. Diana, I think Victoria is what psychologists call a financial psychopath. She doesn't just steal money. She destroys families for the pleasure of proving she can do it. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of my office for a long time. Outside my window, the city lights twinkled like distant stars. Normal people were going home to their families, having dinner, helping with homework, living their uncomplicated lives. Meanwhile, my family had been systematically destroyed by a woman who made it her profession to prey on people who trusted her. My phone rang. Robert's number. Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over? Where's Victoria? She's at home with Brian. Mom, I've been thinking about everything that happened the other day, and I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. Can you come to my office? There are some things I need to tell you about Victoria, and I'd rather do it somewhere private. An hour later, Robert sat in my office, looking like he'd aged another 5 years since I'd last seen him. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. Mom, I can't stop thinking about how I let Victoria convince me you were losing your memory. I questioned my own observations about you because she was so convincing about your supposed decline. I feel like such an idiot. You're not an idiot. You were manipulated by someone very skilled at manipulation, but I should have trusted my own judgment. I should have trusted you. Robert, you need to know that what Victoria did to us, she's done before. To other families. I told him everything Angela had discovered. Victoria's real name, her previous marriages, her pattern of targeting families with assets, her history of convincing people their loved ones were mentally incompetent so she could gain control of their wealth. Robert listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. She's done this to other families? 4 times that we know of. And Robert, there's something else. Something about Brian. I told him about Sarah, about Helen Chen, about how Victoria had likely used forged documents to claim custody of a child she had no legal right to take. Brian's mother was Sarah? My ex-wife, Sarah? It appears so. And his grandmother, Helen, is still alive in Oregon. She thinks she gave up her grandson to his father, not knowing that Victoria was orchestrating the whole thing. Robert buried his face in his hands. Oh God, Brian doesn't even know his real family. He thinks Victoria is his mother, because that's what she's told him. Robert, this woman has been lying about everything since the day she met you. Your marriage, Brian's parentage, my mental state, the company documents, all of it has been part of an elaborate scheme to position herself to steal from our family. What do we do now? I thought about Brian, sleeping peacefully at home with the woman who'd stolen him from his grandmother. I thought about Helen Chen, who'd spent 7 years grieving not just her daughter, but believing she'd lost her grandson too. I thought about the other families Victoria had destroyed, and the ones she might target in the future if we didn't stop her. We're going to make sure she never has the chance to hurt another family the way she's hurt ours. And we're going to make sure Brian knows the truth about his real family. She'll fight us. Let her fight. Robert, I've been dealing with difficult people in business for 35 years. Victoria may be skilled at manipulating emotions, but she's about to learn what happens when she targets someone who's spent decades outmaneuvering people who underestimated her. What's the first step? I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd looked up earlier. The first step is a conversation with Helen Chen. She deserves to know that her grandson is alive and well, and that the woman who took him from her is about to face the consequences of her actions. As the phone rang, I realized that Victoria had made the same mistake that many of my business competitors had made over the years. She'd assumed that because I was older, I was weaker. She'd assumed that because I was trusting, I was naive. She'd assumed that because I loved my family, I wouldn't fight back when they were threatened. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The woman who answered the phone in Oregon had a voice thick with tears when I identified myself and explained why I was calling. "Brian is alive? He's with you?" I thought. Victoria told me Robert wanted full custody, that it would be better for Brian to be with his father's family. "I never heard from any of you again. I thought you didn't want me in his life. Helen? We never knew you existed. Victoria lied to all of us. But that's going to change. Would you like to see your grandson again?" The sob of relief and joy that came through the phone made everything clear. This wasn't just about stopping Victoria or protecting my company anymore. This was about reuniting a family that had been torn apart by a predator who thought she could use love as a weapon. Victoria was about to discover that when you threaten someone's family, you don't just face their anger. You face their determination, their resources, and their absolute refusal to let evil win. The war was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, watching my grandson Brian help his real grandmother Helen make pancakes. The sight of them together, Helen patiently teaching him to flip the pancakes while he giggled at his clumsy attempts, filled me with a peace I hadn't felt in years. The path to this moment had been neither simple nor painless. The evening after my conversation with Helen Chen, Robert and I had sat in my living room planning how to handle the situation with Victoria. We'd agreed that Brian's welfare had to come first, which meant we needed to move carefully and with legal support every step of the way. James Patterson had recommended a family law attorney who specialized in custody cases involving fraud. The legal process had been complex, requiring DNA tests to confirm Brian's parentage, investigations into Victoria's forged documents, and coordination with authorities in Oregon where Helen lived. The hardest part had been the conversation with Brian himself. How do you tell an 8-year-old boy that the woman he'd called mother for most of his life had lied to him about everything? How do you explain that he had a grandmother who'd been grieving his loss for 7 years, believing she'd given him up forever? We'd decided to start slowly. I'd suggested to Robert that we plan a family trip to Oregon, ostensibly to visit some of his father's relatives. Brian had been excited about the adventure, chattering in the car about seeing mountains and maybe finding some interesting rocks for his collection. Helen had been waiting at a small cafe in downtown Portland when we arrived. I'll never forget the moment she saw Brian walk through the door. The recognition was immediate and overwhelming. This woman who'd raised his mother, who'd cared for him during the first year after Sarah's death, who'd reluctantly let him go because she thought it was best for him. "Brian?" she'd whispered, rising from her chair with tears streaming down her face. Brian had looked at her curiously, then at Robert. "Dad, who is this lady?" "Brian," Robert had said gently, "this is Helen. She's your mom Sarah's mother, your other grandmother." The reunion had been emotional and complicated. Brian had been confused, asking questions about why he'd never met Helen before, why no one had told him about his mom Sarah, why Victoria had said Helen didn't want to see him. We'd spent 3 days in Oregon, giving Brian time to get to know Helen gradually. She'd shown him photo albums full of pictures of his mother, told him stories about Sarah's childhood, shared memories that helped him understand where he came from. Meanwhile, the legal machinery had been grinding forward. Angela's investigation had provided law enforcement with enough evidence to arrest Victoria on multiple charges of fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment. When the police came to arrest her, she'd tried to claim that Robert was unstable and that I was manipulating him, but the documentation was too overwhelming. The criminal trial had taken 4 months. Victoria's defense attorney had tried to paint her as a misguided woman who genuinely believed she was helping the families she'd targeted, but the evidence of her systematic deception across multiple states had been too damning. She'd been sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to all her victims. More importantly for our family, the family court had ruled that Victoria had fraudulently obtained custody of Brian and that Helen Chen was his rightful guardian. However, Recognizing that Brian had bonded with Robert and had been living as his son for years, the court had established a joint custody arrangement that allowed Brian to split his time between Oregon with Helen and here with Robert. It had been an adjustment for everyone. Brian had struggled with understanding why Victoria had lied to him, why she'd kept him from his real grandmother, why adults he'd trusted had been deceiving him about his own life. Robert had enrolled him in counseling to help him process the complex emotions of discovering that much of his early life had been built on lies. But children are remarkably resilient. Within a few months, Brian had adapted to having two homes and seemed to thrive on the expanded sense of family. He'd started calling Helen Grandma Helen and me Grandma Diana, and had made it clear that he considered himself lucky to have so many people who loved him. Helen had moved to our city 3 months ago, settling into a small apartment just 10 minutes from Robert's house. She'd wanted to be closer to Brian during the school year, and Robert had been grateful for the support. Watching them together, I could see so much of Sarah in both of them. Helen had her daughter's gentle way with children, and Brian had inherited Sarah's curiosity about the world around him. "Grandma Diana, are these ready?" Brian called out, holding up a slightly lopsided pancake. "They look perfect," I said, carrying a platter of bacon to the table where Robert was setting out plates and napkins. Robert looked different now. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for years was gone. He'd told me that he felt like he could breathe again, like he'd been holding his breath for 8 years without realizing it. He'd started dating again, cautiously, but with the wisdom that comes from having been deceived so completely once before. As for me, the experience had changed my perspective on retirement and succession planning. I decided to remain active in the company for a few more years, but with a more structured transition plan. Robert had proven himself capable of handling increased responsibilities, and I'd brought in additional management to ensure that no single person could ever again manipulate the company's operations the way Victoria had attempted to do. We'd also established new protocols for document verification, financial oversight, and decision-making transparency. The company was stronger now, more resilient against the kind of systematic deception Victoria had attempted. "Mom," Robert said as we sat down to eat, "Helen and I were talking about next weekend. Brian wants to show her that hiking trail you used to take me to when I was his age." "The one up by Silver Lake?" "That's the one. Would you like to come with us?" I looked around the table at this reconstructed family. Brian was drowning his pancakes in syrup while telling Helen about his science project. Helen was listening with the patient attention of someone making up for lost time. Robert was relaxed and smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before he'd met Victoria. "I'd love to come," I said. After breakfast, while Helen and Brian worked on a puzzle in the living room, Robert and I cleaned up the kitchen together. It was something we'd done countless times when he was growing up, a comfortable routine that had been interrupted by years of Victoria's subtle interference in our relationship. "Mom, I need to thank you for something," he said as he dried the dishes I handed him. "For what?" "For not giving up on us. For fighting for our family even when I couldn't see what was happening. Robert, you were being manipulated by someone very skilled at manipulation. That's not your fault." "Maybe not, but I should have trusted my instincts about you. I knew you weren't losing your memory or becoming confused. I knew you were still the sharp, capable woman who'd raised me. But Victoria was so convincing, so consistent in her concerns about you, that I started doubting my own observations." I dried my hands and turned to face him. "That's how predators like Victoria operate. They make you doubt yourself so you'll trust them instead. You're not the first person to fall for that kind of manipulation, and unfortunately, you won't be the last. Do you think she'll try again after she gets out of prison? I think we've documented her pattern well enough that she'll have a much harder time finding new victims, and I think 8 years in prison might convince her to find a different line of work. What if it doesn't? Then Angela Martinez and I will be ready for her." Robert smiled. "Remind me never to cross you in business. Wise policy." From the living room came the sound of Brian's laughter and Helen's gentle voice explaining something about the puzzle they were working on. It was the sound of a family healing, of connections being rebuilt, of trust being restored. That evening, after Helen had returned to her apartment and Robert had taken Brian home, I sat in my quiet house with a cup of tea and thought about the note that had started this whole journey. "Your daughter-in-law set you up. 4 words that had saved my family from complete destruction. I never did find out who had slipped that note through my car window. The young woman who delivered it had disappeared into the city before I could get a good look at her. But I suspected she might have been connected to one of Victoria's previous victims, someone who'd recognized the pattern and decided to act. Whoever she was, I was grateful. That anonymous warning had given me the chance to see Victoria's deception before it was too late, before she'd succeeded in having me declared incompetent, before she'd destroyed my relationship with my son permanently, before she'd disappeared with Brian and left us all devastated. Looking back, I realized that Victoria's biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating me. It had been underestimating the power of family bonds that run deeper than her ability to manipulate them. She'd thought she could replace those bonds with carefully crafted lies, but real love and trust, once tested and proven genuine, are stronger than any deception. My phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Grandma Diana, thank you for the best Sunday ever. Can we do it again next week?" I typed back, "Every Sunday, sweetheart. Every Sunday." As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. My family was safe. My company was secure. A child had been reunited with his real grandmother. A predator had been stopped before she could hurt anyone else. Victoria had tried to steal my family, my business, and my identity. Instead, she'd inadvertently given me something more valuable than anything she could have taken. She'd given me the absolute certainty that the people I loved were worth fighting for, and that I still had the strength to protect them. The succession meeting that had started this whole ordeal was finally rescheduled for next month. This time, it would happen on my terms, in my time, with my family united and strong. Robert would take over the company when he was ready, and when I was ready, not because someone had manipulated us into believing I was incompetent. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I smiled thinking about next Sunday's pancake breakfast. Helen would be there, and Brian, and Robert. We'd plan our hiking trip to Silver Lake. We'd laugh and tell stories and build new memories to replace the ones that had been tainted by Victoria's lies. It wasn't the family I'd expected to have at this stage of my life, but it was the family that had emerged from the ashes of Victoria's destruction, and it was perfect exactly as it was: honest, loving, and unbreakably strong. The note had been right. My daughter-in-law had set me up, but in the end, she'd set herself up for a fall that would protect countless other families from her predatory schemes. Sometimes justice comes disguised as a family breakfast on a Sunday morning, with slightly lopsided pancakes and the sound of a child's laughter filling a kitchen that had been too quiet for too long.